warnings, and secrets that no one wanted to believe. The Pacific Ocean, 1941. A stretch of deep blue water separating two rising powers, the United States and Imperial Japan. To most Americans, war felt far away, something raging in the dusty deserts of North Africa or the snows of Europe. The islands of Hawaii were paradise, calm, distant, and safe. But beneath that calm, the ocean was stirring. Plans were being drawn, fleets were moving, and decisions were being made that would soon set the entire world on fire. A world on edge. By mid-1941, the world was already at war. Nazi Germany had conquered most of Europe. Britain was standing alone, fighting for survival. And in the East, Japan had become a military giant, hungry for resources, driven by ideology, and determined to dominate Asia. Japan's ambitions were clear: control China, the Philippines, and the rich oil fields of Southeast Asia. But one thing stood in its way: the United States of America. When Japan invaded French Indochina, Washington responded with a crippling embargo. Oil, steel, and rubber, the lifeblood of Japan's war machine, were suddenly cut off. Without them, Japan's empire would suffocate. Inside Tokyo's imperial palace, war hawks pressed for one desperate solution: strike first. And so began Operation Z, a plan so daring, so precise, it bordered on madness. The architect of attack. At the center of the plan stood Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, commander of the Imperial Japanese Navy. A Harvard-educated strategist, Yamamoto understood America, its people, its pride, its power. He warned his superiors, "In the first 6 months of war with the United States and Great Britain, I will run wild, but I have no confidence for the long war." Still, duty outweighed doubt. Yamamoto's plan was simple yet devastating: cripple the U.S. Pacific Fleet before it could fight back. If Japan could destroy America's battleships at Pearl Harbor, the U.S. would be forced to negotiate, or so they hoped. In secrecy, Japan assembled a massive strike force: 6 aircraft carriers, 2 battleships, hundreds of planes, and thousands of sailors. It would travel across 3,000 miles of open ocean, unseen, to deliver a single, decisive blow. They called it Kido Butai, the most powerful naval strike group the world had ever seen. America's blind confidence. Across the ocean, in Washington, D.C., American officials knew tensions were rising. Diplomatic cables from Tokyo had grown colder, more aggressive. The U.S. had even broken parts of Japan's secret diplomatic code, known as the Purple Code. Every day, intelligence officers decoded intercepted messages between Tokyo and Japanese embassies around the world. They read warnings, orders, and updates, but nothing that clearly said where Japan would strike. Some thought the Philippines, others believed Thailand or British Malaya. Almost no one imagined Hawaii. After all, why would Japan attack Pearl Harbor over 4,000 miles away in the middle of the Pacific? It seemed impossible. The calm before the strike. In the early days of December 1941, Honolulu glowed in tropical peace. Soldiers played baseball on the fields near Hickam Air Base. Navy men sipped coffee and wrote letters home. Sunday was coming. A day of rest, family, and church. Far to the north, the Japanese fleet moved silently through rough winter seas. Communication was forbidden. Not a single radio signal was sent. Each sailor aboard those carriers knew, once the sun rose over Oahu, there would be no turning back. Meanwhile, in Washington, something strange was happening. Cryptologists working for the U.S. Army's Signal Intelligence Service began intercepting a 14-part message from Tokyo to its embassy in D.C. It was long, coded, and urgent. As analysts decrypted it line by line, the message became clear. Japan was breaking off negotiations with the United States. It was a sign of war. But the timing wasn't clear. No one knew when or where Japan would strike. And on the night of December 6th, President Franklin D. Roosevelt himself read the partial translation. He turned to his aide and murmured, "This means war. The invisible hand of fate." Still, the machinery of peace or denial kept turning. Military commands in Hawaii received vague warnings to stay alert, but no one sounded an alarm. No aircraft were dispersed. Ships remained neatly lined up in Battleship Row, an easy target. General Short, commander of the Army in Hawaii, believed sabotage, not air attack, was the greatest threat. So instead of spreading his aircraft out, he grouped them together to protect them from saboteurs. It was a fatal mistake. And then, the last chance to change history slipped away. They saw the signs, they heard the signals, but by the time they understood the message, the planes were already in the sky. December 6, 1941. Across Washington, D.C., in the dim glow of desk lamps and the humming of typewriters, a small group of men and women worked tirelessly. These were America's silent sentinels, cryptologists, radio operators, and analysts who had dedicated themselves to decoding the labyrinthine communications of the Imperial Japanese government. They were ordinary Americans doing extraordinary work, unaware that their efforts would soon intersect with one of history's deadliest surprises. The puzzle of purple. At the heart of their work was the so-called Purple Code. This cipher, named for the colored label used by the U.S. to catalog it, protected Japan's most sensitive diplomatic communications. Messages were carefully encrypted, scrambled into sequences of letters and symbols, designed to be impossible to read. But American intelligence had a secret weapon, a team of mathematicians and linguists who had, after months of painstaking effort, begun to unravel it. For the first time, Washington had access to Japan's private diplomatic language. Each day, analysts decrypted messages revealing negotiations, troop movements, and political maneuverings. Yet there was a crucial limitation. These messages were diplomatic, not operational. Japan's naval code, the system used to coordinate fleet movements, remained largely unbroken. This created a dangerous gap. Officials could understand Japan's intentions in words, but not in action. The intelligence suggested hostility, but it did not pinpoint the precise target. Was Japan planning to strike the Philippines, British Malaya, or somewhere else in the Pacific? The question haunted the analysts, but they lacked certainty. A chain of alerts. Meanwhile, across the Pacific, American military commanders in Hawaii were uneasy. Radio intercepts and scattered intelligence reports hinted at Japanese aggression. There were signs: suspicious radio traffic, unusual fleet movements reported by distant observers, and Japanese diplomatic communiques growing increasingly belligerent. In theory, these alerts should have triggered immediate precautionary measures. Aircraft could have been dispersed, battleships moved to safer positions, and air patrols increased. But in practice, the chain of command was fragmented. The U.S. Army and Navy operated independently on Oahu, each convinced the other was more capable of assessing risk. Warnings went up the chain, then back down, often diluted, misunderstood, or delayed. It was a bureaucratic trap. The very system designed to protect the islands became a source of confusion. One message might take hours to reach the right officer, and by the time it arrived, the situation had already changed. The final intercept. In Washington, the intelligence team was racing against time. On December 6th, they intercepted a 14-part coded message from Tokyo to its embassy in D.C. Each segment of the message arrived in fragments, demanding translation and decryption. Analysts worked through the night, piecing together the content. The messages confirmed what had been feared: Japan was severing diplomatic ties. The tone was unmistakable: a final rejection of negotiation, an unambiguous march toward conflict. But the precise timing remained unknown. Some officials believed the strike might occur days later, perhaps weeks. No one anticipated the immediacy of the threat. At 3 a.m., the last segments were partially decoded. The warning was clear, but the instruction on delivery was vague. A sense of urgency swept through the office. Teletypes and telegraphs were fired off to Pearl Harbor, but the process was painfully slow. Each message had to be translated, typed, transmitted over long-distance lines, and delivered to the right officer in Hawaii. In some cases, clerical delays added precious minutes. In others, human error altered the phrasing, making it sound less urgent than it truly was. Time, as it often does in moments of history, became the enemy. Radar's silent cry. Even as Washington struggled with codes and cables, an unexpected ally stood ready: early warning radar stations on Oahu. These newly installed systems, a marvel of modern technology, could detect approaching aircraft hundreds of miles out. On the morning of December 7th, just before sunrise, one station picked up an unusual cluster of planes heading south at high speed. Two young operators reported the blip immediately, their voices calm but urgent. Large formation bearing north-northwest, approximately 200 aircraft, they noted. Easing. Misinterpretation and miscommunication. Across the island, commanders were juggling incomplete information. Intelligence officers sent messages, officers gave verbal briefings, and reports crisscrossed between Army and Navy commands. Each step introduced potential misinterpretation. Some messages overemphasized diplomacy and downplayed risk. Others highlighted threats but lacked specificity. Even among those aware of the possibility of an attack, the scale was unimaginable. The idea that hundreds of aircraft could descend simultaneously on the harbor, sinking battleships and bombing airfields, was beyond comprehension. The human mind, conditioned to peacetime assumptions, rejected the likelihood of such a catastrophic strike. This combination of fragmented intelligence, human error, and underestimation of Japanese capabilities created the perfect storm. The invisible clues were everywhere, yet no one saw the full picture until it was too late. A nation on the edge. At 6 a.m. in Honolulu, sailors and soldiers went about their Sunday routines. Some read newspapers, others polished rifles or performed maintenance on aircraft. Families on the streets smiled, unaware that a meticulously planned strike was minutes away. Meanwhile, in Tokyo, the Japanese fleet had crossed the international dateline. The pilots, technicians, and sailors aboard the carriers prepared for launch. The hours of secrecy and navigation culminated in a single, orchestrated moment. When they struck, it would be sudden, devastating, and unforgettable. Back in Washington, the last telegrams reached Hawaii, far too late to change events. The intelligence had existed, the clues were there, but the timing and delivery failed. History would later record this as a tragedy of miscommunication, a perfect example of how information, no matter how accurate, can be useless if not acted upon in time. The tension before the roar. As the morning sun rose over Oahu, a strange calm settled across the island. Officers drank coffee, men strolled along the docks. Radar operators checked equipment, and code breakers continued their work in Washington. Everything seemed normal, yet the invisible forces of fate were already in motion. The ships in Battleship Row sat vulnerable, the planes on runways were lined up, and the first bombs were only minutes away. It was in this silence, filled with overlooked signals and unheeded warnings, that the world held its breath, unaware that by the end of the morning, Pearl Harbor would be transformed from paradise into a battlefield. The sky turns to fire. At 7:55 a.m., the sky over Hawaii screamed, and history shattered in a single roar. Sunday morning broke over Pearl Harbor with the kind of serenity that belied the catastrophe about to unfold. Golden sunlight shimmered across calm waters. The harbor was alive with routine, sailors polishing brass, maintenance crews checking engines, and families strolling along the waterfront. Even the distant hum of early aircraft training exercises seemed ordinary. Yet, far beyond the horizon, hundreds of Japanese planes were already forming into attack formations, perfectly timed to strike simultaneously. The first wave emerges. The first wave, launched from 6 aircraft carriers hundreds of miles north, consisted of 183 aircraft, torpedo bombers, dive bombers, and fighters. Pilots, trained to precision, held their positions, gliding low over the water to avoid detection. At precisely 7:48 a.m., radar stations reported unusual aircraft patterns, but by then, the planes were too close for meaningful counteraction. Minutes later, the first bombs fell. The USS Arizona, pride of the Pacific Fleet, was hit almost immediately. A torpedo struck near the forward magazine, igniting a catastrophic chain reaction. In an instant, the battleship erupted in flames, sending a column of smoke high into the sky. Sailors on deck had no chance to escape. The blast killed more than 1,000 men in seconds. Simultaneously, other battleships along Battleship Row were hit. The USS Oklahoma rolled violently to port after multiple torpedo strikes, trapping hundreds of sailors inside its hull. The harbor, once calm and orderly, became a scene of chaos, smoke, and fire. The airfields under siege. The Japanese plan was meticulous. The Navy and Air Force installations were secondary targets, but equally critical. Ford Island and Bellows Field housed hundreds of U.S. aircraft, many fully fueled and ready for training. Dive bombers and fighter planes strafed the airfields, destroying planes on the ground before they could take off. Pilots and ground crews scrambled, firing whatever weapons they could access. Some planes managed to get airborne, engaging the attackers in desperate dogfights, but they were heavily outnumbered and taken by surprise. The second wave strikes. By 8:50 a.m., the first wave had returned to its carriers to refuel and rearm, while the second wave arrived, 171 aircraft this time, more heavily armed with bombs. The second strike was designed to target ships not destroyed in the initial attack and further devastate airfields. This wave inflicted additional destruction on the harbor and nearby installations. The USS Nevada, attempting to escape, faced torpedo attacks and aerial bombing but managed to beach itself, preventing complete destruction. Meanwhile, anti-aircraft gunners, previously untested in live combat, fired at the incoming planes with mixed results. Some succeeded in downing attackers, but the damage inflicted was minimal compared to the overall devastation. The human perspective. While statistics and numbers illustrate the scale of the attack, the human stories reveal the true horror. Sailors scrambled in oil-slicked waters, some attempting to rescue comrades trapped on sinking ships. Officers and crew members fought fires, launched lifeboats, and coordinated emergency responses under relentless enemy fire. Onshore, civilians witnessed the sky filled with enemy planes and smoke columns rising from the harbor. Ordinary people were forced into extraordinary action, moving loved ones to safety, helping the injured, and improvising responses to the sudden chaos. Entire neighborhoods were suddenly part of a battlefield, their serenity replaced with fear and confusion. In one particularly tragic story, a group of naval mechanics working on aircraft near Ford Island saw their hangars engulfed in flames. Many were trapped while others improvised, using hoses, buckets, and anything available to save equipment and personnel. Their bravery, though valiant, could not stop the scale of destruction unfolding. The Japanese perspective. From the Japanese carriers, the attack appeared flawless. Commander Mitsuo Fuchida, flying the lead Zero, coordinated the strikes with precision. Every torpedo launched, every bomb dropped, had been calculated to maximize destruction and shock. Pilots described the harbor as a scene of controlled chaos, with fires erupting across the water, explosions tearing through battleships, and smoke forming thick black clouds that obscured targets. Yet even amid victory, Japanese leaders were aware that such audacity carried enormous risk. Carrier groups, operating thousands of miles from friendly territory, were vulnerable to counterattack. The element of surprise was their greatest ally, and they relied on perfect timing to return safely to their carriers. Technological and tactical mastery. The success of the attack was not merely a product of surprise. It was also a display of Japan's technological and tactical prowess. Torpedo planes, modified for shallow harbor conditions, hit ships with devastating effect. Dive bombers targeted decks and superstructures with pinpoint accuracy. Fighter escorts eliminated American planes attempting to take off. The entire operation had been rehearsed and refined for months, making it arguably the most precise naval strike in history up to that point. Radar and early warning systems, though innovative, failed to provide actionable intelligence. Human error compounded the technological limitations. Misinterpretation of blips on radar screens, combined with assumptions that approaching planes were friendly, allowed the attackers to reach their targets unchallenged. Chaos and heroism. Amid the devastation, acts of heroism emerged spontaneously. Sailors abandoned damaged ships to rescue fellow crewmen. Soldiers manned anti-aircraft guns with little training, holding their positions under intense fire. Civilians carried the wounded to safer areas, and medics triaged hundreds of injured men in makeshift hospitals. One famous story recounts a young sailor who repeatedly dove into burning water to save trapped shipmates. Another describes a small team of Marines who, under enemy strafing, pushed a critically wounded pilot to safety. These individual acts of courage punctuated the overwhelming tragedy, demonstrating resilience and valor in the face of total chaos. The immediate aftermath. By 9:45 a.m., the second wave had completed its mission and begun withdrawing toward the carriers. Pearl Harbor was left smoldering. 8 battleships damaged or sunk, nearly 200 aircraft destroyed, and thousands of lives lost or injured. Fires raged unchecked for hours, oil floated across the harbor, and the familiar skyline of the naval base was transformed into a scene of carnage. The attack had achieved its immediate objectives: surprise, destruction of naval and air assets, and psychological shock. Yet, despite the tactical brilliance, the long-term strategic consequences would prove disastrous for Japan. The U.S., initially unprepared, now faced a clear imperative: total mobilization for war. The sleeping giant awakens. Out of the smoke and ruins rose something far more powerful than vengeance: resolve. The morning of December 7, 1941, ended with Pearl Harbor in flames. Fires raged across the harbor, smoke twisted skyward, and the cries of the wounded echoed over the water. Amidst the devastation, America was left stunned, shocked, and profoundly aware that its era of peace had abruptly ended. Yet from this chaos emerged a determination that would redefine the nation and the course of the world. Immediate human toll. The human cost of the attack was staggering. More than 400 Americans lost their lives, including sailors trapped inside sinking ships, airmen caught on strafed runways, and civilians hit by stray bombs. Another 200 were wounded, some critically. Families waited in anxious silence for news, while rescue crews combed through the wreckage to recover the injured and the dead. One of the hardest-hit ships, the USS Arizona, became the symbol of the tragedy. Its forward magazine had exploded violently, killing over 1,000 crew members in an instant. The remains of the ship still smoldered days later, a permanent reminder of the sudden, brutal reality of war. Nearby, the USS Oklahoma lay capsized, hundreds of sailors trapped within its hull. Courageous rescue efforts saved many lives, but countless others were lost beneath the twisted steel. A nation reacts. As news spread across the United States, shock turned to outrage. Newspapers splashed headlines describing the treacherous and unprovoked attack. Radio broadcasts relayed eyewitness accounts of ships burning, planes falling, and sailors struggling in the water. Every city and town felt the weight of the event. Pearl Harbor was no longer distant. It was personal. President Franklin D. Roosevelt, informed immediately of the attack, called a special session of Congress. On December 8th, he addressed the nation in a speech that would become historic. Yesterday, December 7, 1941, a date which will live in infamy, the United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked by naval and air forces of the Empire of Japan. The speech was both measured and fiery. Roosevelt condemned the attack, honored the fallen, and declared that the United States would respond with all its might. By the end of the day, Congress had voted overwhelmingly to declare war on Japan, thrusting America fully into the global conflict. Global consequences. The attack on Pearl Harbor did not just alter American history, it reshaped the entire world order. Within 3 days, Germany and Italy, allies of Japan, declared war on the United States. The European and Pacific theaters of World War II became fully interconnected. The United States, previously a supplier of aid and material, was now a participant in total war. Strategists and analysts immediately recognized that Japan's tactical success at Pearl Harbor would be overshadowed by the strategic consequences. By provoking a unified, industrialized nation, the attack had awakened a, quote, sleeping giant, a term later attributed to Admiral Yamamoto, the architect of the strike. His calculations had been precise in the short term, but he had underestimated America's capacity to mobilize, adapt, and retaliate. Military mobilization. Within weeks, American shipyards, factories, and military bases were transformed. Battleships were repaired or rebuilt, aircraft production accelerated, and recruitment surged. Men and women across the nation enlisted, driven by patriotism, outrage, and a desire to defend their homeland. Technology, too, became a focus. Radar stations were improved, anti-aircraft defenses upgraded, and cryptography received unprecedented resources. The mistakes of Pearl Harbor, delayed warnings, miscommunication, underestimation of the enemy, became lessons for a rapidly modernizing military. The Doolittle Raid, launched in April 1942, was the first direct American response. Though limited in scale, it delivered a powerful psychological message. Japan was no longer untouchable. and America's reach extended across the Pacific. Intelligence reforms. The attack also exposed glaring weaknesses in intelligence coordination. The fragmented communication between Washington and Hawaii, between the Navy and the Army, and between codebreakers and field commanders had allowed the Japanese to achieve near-perfect surprise. In response, the United States began overhauling its intelligence apparatus. New centralized organizations were created to integrate signals intelligence, human intelligence, and cryptography. The foundations for what would later become the Central Intelligence Agency, CIA, were laid. Radar technology was expanded and connected to early warning systems.